I know. So, okay. Hello, everyone. Hello and welcome to Florida International University in Washington, D.C. We are Miami's public research university, and we're delighted to have you all here today to experience all that our FIU and D.C. Showcase Center has to offer. And I've just received news today, actually, that we're proud to share that FIU has been awarded $3 million Founding Principal Civics Education Grant in collaboration with the U.S. Department of Education to develop innovative programming in celebration of America 250. Through this initiative, we look forward to advancing civic education and fostering greater understanding of our nation's founding principles. And with that in mind, I'm so happy to kick this off. I would like to thank you all so much for joining me, and I hope that from today's conversation, we can really take away some meaningful fruits, especially as we approach our nation's 250th anniversary. I mean, that doesn't happen every day. So I'd first like to start off kind of making it a little official, right? So I'm going to quote a statement from the official America 250 initiative, right? On July 4th, 2026, our nation will commemorate and celebrate the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. The journey toward this historic milestone is an opportunity to pause and reflect on our nation's past, honor the contributions of all Americans, and look ahead toward the future we want to create for the next generation and beyond. Harry S. Truman, the 33rd President of the United States, mentioned, "You got to know history if you're going to be a good citizen." Now, this isn't simply a remark on the importance of studying history. It's a call to action. So many of us here, we're all young adults, and we've all just unlocked this new level of social and political agency, right? And with that comes not only opportunity, but a responsibility. And this responsibility means how are we going to shape this next chapter of American democracy? And so this is one of the reasons why, with the counsel and the perspective of our impressive panel, which I will introduce in a moment, we'll be able to approach this 250th anniversary with a well-informed foundation. So I have with me here today Dr. James Benton from Georgetown University, professor of history. I have Samuel Holliday from the U.S. Capitol Historical Society, Sarah Fling from the White House Historical Association, and Randy Barnett, professor of constitutional law at Georgetown University Law Center. And so to kind of break the ice, get the ball rolling, I have an icebreaker question. And so the icebreaker question is, how can the 250th anniversary, how can the commemoration of this anniversary help bridge divides? And if anyone would like to, volunteer to answer, that would be amazing. Who wants to do it?
I can start. Is this okay? Hi, everybody. My name is Sarah Fling. As Emily mentioned, I'm a historian at the White House Historical Association. I'm here today speaking in my personal capacity as a public historian rather than on behalf of my employer. And I am also a Youth 250 lead, which is a community bureau of 100 young adults who are helping to shape commemorations for the 250th next year. And I think in terms of what the 250th can do to bring us together, we have a unique once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for most people, for people to actually care about history and be engaged and listening to why history matters. For me, I'm 28. In the next 50 years, when we have another major commemoration, I'm probably not going to be out in the streets celebrating or doing much to support, right? So this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to be involved in something to this scale. And when many people from different demographics, geographic regions, backgrounds, and interests are talking about history, we have a real opportunity to talk to them and open a new dialogue, especially at museums and historic sites. rights. This is a chance for people to come together, to have a trusted institution where people can come, learn truth, have accountability, and talk about what the 250th means not only for the past, but for the next 250 years. So I think that's why it's an exciting time, especially for a new generation, to come together across generational divides, geographic divides, partisan divides, and talk about the things that we have in common.
Thank you, Sarah. That was great. With this, I actually had a question for you, Dr. Holliday. So in your role, you've engaged in meaningful dialogue with prominent historians and overseen programs that illuminate U.S. history for the public. So based on these conversations that you've had, can you maybe speak or enlighten us on any insights or lessons that you believe carry a special weight as we enter this 250th year of our nation?
Just make sure. Okay, this is working. Thank you, Emily. And that's you do me too much credit. Unless there be any stolen academic value here, I'm just got a master's degree. I'll be Doc Holliday was the gunslinging dentist of the Old West, but I should be so lucky as to make such a mark on American history. But no, thank you for that question. I think one of the touchstones that I've taken away from my privileged position, and I'm realizing that among the distinguished scholars we've interviewed over the years, Professor Barnett has been a guest on some of our programming at the Historical Society. But something I've taken away is that as we think about the founding era, the founders set forth a set of principles that perhaps grander than they even intended them to be, were larger than our capacity to meet them through much of our history, but that the ideas themselves are worth striving for. There's the line from the Constitution, in order to form the preamble to the Constitution, in order to form a more perfect union. It's not a perfect union. It's recognized that there's going to be some work here, and that work is going to take some time. And in fact, it's dare I say, never finished. But there's glory in the striving, and that throughout every chapter of American history, there are bright spots and blemishes. History is difficult and nuanced, as I'm sure we're going to talk a lot about tonight. But through it all, there's been something to hang on to with the idea, that the ideas are sometimes better than our ability to meet them. But we should always try to meet them, to try to make that more perfect union. And that's borne out by so many wonderful, heroic examples throughout American history of people who have striven towards that goal.
Yeah, no, I mean, I completely agree, especially when you mentioned kind of drawing from these figures in history and, bringing them back from the past and putting them on this stage that is America's 250th. I have a question for Dr. Benton over there at the far end. So you are director of the Kalmanovitz Initiative, right? And so through your work at the Kalmanovitz Initiative and your research on trade policy and industrial decline, you've explored how economic forces shape inequality. And you've connected students at Georgetown directly with communities confronting these challenges. As we mark America's 250th anniversary, what lessons from your scholarship and community partnerships do you believe are most urgent for understanding and addressing structural inequality today? It's kind of a big one.
It's a big one, but historians are used to tackling large questions and taking them apart, putting things back together again. A couple of clarifications I'd like to make.
Of course.
I'm not a professor of history. I do have a doctorate in U.S. history, but I officially work as director of the Race and Economic Empowerment Project, which is part of the Kalmanovitz Initiative. We can just call it KI for short. Everybody just, those two initials, you're good. To the substance of your question, I mean, we like to think of history as this thing that's moving forward constantly, upward and forward. And as a labor historian, I can tell you there are a lot of failures in that too. We talk about things like the minimum wage and the 40-hour week as though we take those for granted. They've been around for about 90 years. But what people don't realize is that the social movement that brought those into being worked for nearly 70 years before they actually got to see it. And some of the people who fought for that died without seeing the Fair Labor Standards Act or the Social Security Act or other pieces of New Deal legislation come into fruition. So, you know, the lesson that I try to impart upon students is that the path of history is not always upward and forward. Sometimes it stalls. Sometimes it takes a step back. Sometimes there are moments of confusion. But through it all, there's this idea that people are pushing to make things better. I gave a talk a couple weeks ago where, in a program about a month ago, where we discussed the history of protest in the United States. And the metaphor emerged in our conversation, in those two conversations, that we are guardians of a legacy that people who we don't know, who came before us, fought to bring into being. And we are the protectors of a legacy for those who come after us, who we may not even know. And so the idea is that we're holding on to something, and our responsibility is to try to make it better. And so through that, I try to talk with students that, you know, you're being an informed citizen about the shortcomings, the successes, the failures, the work that is to be done in not just building a nation, but building a community, a human community, the community in which you reside, the larger global community of which you are a part. All that falls on your shoulders, and it behooves you to be as well knowledge, you know, to have as much knowledge about the world you live in so that you can go out and make a significant impact upon it. And it may not be like changing laws through great social movements. It may be something as small as being a good civic leader. It may be something as nuclear as being a good parent or son or daughter or sibling or partner or what have you. So the idea is that your knowledge prepares you to go out into the world and to fight for the things that we believe in, to create a better society, not just for ourselves, but for those people who follow us.
Thank you, thank you. I also have a question for you, Mr. Barnett. So, given your scholarship on constitutional theory and originalism, how do the nation's founding principles continue to guide or challenge policymaking and public debate today? Another big one.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. And I just want to endorse everything that my co-panelists said. I'm in complete agreement. So far, no disagreement yet. I agree with everything they said. I will say that because I'm 73, I definitely won't be around in 50 years to celebrate the next one. But you might be. I mean, don't count yourself out. You know, I hope to be around when I'm 78. So I think you could make it. Yeah, well, I think the most important thing about 250 is that it reminds us that the Constitution is not our founding document. The country was founded in 1776, and our founding document is the Declaration of Independence. And then after that, we had two cracks at government. First, the Articles of Confederation, then the U.S. Constitution. And the U.S. Constitution we got in 1789 is not the U.S. Constitution that we have today. It's been amended 27 times. It is in some very significant ways, affecting the structure of government in profound ways. And so, as an originalist, I'm interested in the original meaning of the enacted Constitution, regardless of when it was enacted. So we have amendments going up all the way from the founding until today. But I'm also interested in the founding principle that that first the Articles and then the Confederation and then the Constitution were trying to fulfill, trying to execute. So what are those principles? Well, the first of the statements everybody knows by heart, and that is, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among which are rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But it's the next sentence that follows that states the American theory of government. And it says, to secure these rights, which rights? The rights in the previous sentence, the individual rights in the previous sentence. To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That is the American theory of government. First come rights, then comes government. First come we the people as sovereigns, and government is enacted to secure the rights of we the people, not a majority of we the people, not a minority of we the people, but we the people, each and every one of us. And it's with that spirit and that theory that we then have these different forms of government. We've had different forms of government in this country, starting with the Articles, then through the Constitution, and then really significantly changed, for example, in the wake of the Civil War with the Reconstruction Amendments. So why then am I an originalist? What is it that, first of all, I should tell you everybody what originalism is. I don't expect anyone to know that. And it can be summarized in a single sentence. And that is that the meaning of the Constitution should remain the same until it's properly changed by amendment. That's it. That's all originalism is. The meaning of the Constitution should remain the same until it's properly changed by amendment. And why would that be the case? Why should the meaning of the Constitution remain the same until it's properly changed by amendment? Because the Constitution is not the law that governs us. The Constitution is the law that governs those who govern us. And it would not serve its purpose as the law that governs those who govern us if those who are to be governed by the Constitution could change the meaning to something they prefer without going through the amendment process, which involves we the people. Then it would be for us to change the laws they make to govern us without going through the legislative process. So we have to go through the legislative process to change the laws they make to govern us, and they need to go through the amendment process to change the laws change the law that governs them, which is the U.S. Constitution. That's why I'm interested in what is the meaning of the Constitution that remains the same until it's properly changed.
Wow. The Constitution governs the people who govern us.
Yeah.
Wow.
Doesn't govern us.
Mind blowing. Sorry, I'm going to write that down later. So I have a question for Samuel and for Sarah. You guys both work in public facing institutions, public history institutions. So my question is, how can public institutions, whether museums or even universities, or civic organizations like Dr. Benton, help foster a more inclusive understanding of America's story? And you can maybe, one of you can start.
Sure, I can start and then I'll pass it over to Sam. So I think first to talk about this, you have to understand one of the key tenets of public history, which is shared authority. The idea that history is a consensus, that we're building it with other people, that history is not just from somebody in the ivory tower, but that we can build it every day with members of the community, descendants, and other people who have a stake in that history beyond just yourself, whether that's a scholar or a practitioner, etc. And so I think when you really come to this key tenet of public history being shared authority, then it means listening to other people and opening your mind to other stories. And that's why museums and historic sites are uniquely situated then to widen the narrative and widen the scope of whose stories are part of that historical narrative. I think it's really important for museums and public history sites to kind of serve as a mirror, where when you go there, you can see yourself in the history that you're reading, in a label, in the stories that you see there, and that's why it matters to you. If you don't see yourself in the history, then you don't consider yourself part of the history-making process, and history is a process, as we're hearing already. It's not something that passively happens to people and that happened in the past. Instead, you're part of it. And so as a result, I think it's really important for museums and historic sites to stand their ground in sharing as many forms of history as possible, including as many voices as possible, whether that means oral histories that they do within a local community, whether that means listening to people that haven't necessarily been listened to in the past, or stories that have been purposely left out of the archive and silenced. That's really the role of practitioners in public history, is to open their mind, listen to these stories from other voices, so that we can represent more people in the way that history is shared for generations to come.
Thank you, Dr. Holiday. Mr. Holiday.
Well, I will first just co-sign everything Sarah just said. As a tremendously gifted public history practitioner that she is, we're glad to work with her. I would just add, part of the way I conceive of public history as well is the making practical of history for people, sort of bringing history to people where they are so they can take it and do something with it. And so it's not only expanding the scope of whose stories get told, but telling how people made history in their time and presenting it in such a way that people can understand how they can go and make their own history now. And so it's a matter of, as we think through this touchstone of America 250, when we're having this collective moment, this collective focus on history, that we can take it and do something with it, that the history is accessible, is reachable, is understandable, and is, yes, practical, so that we can keep building that informed citizenship that Dr. Benton mentioned, so that people can, as they go out and as we go live in these crazy topsy-turvy times, we can be equipped with the knowledge of what's come before us, how people have worked through the challenges that they faced before us, and we can go out and do the best we can with what we've got.
Thank you so much. And so I kind of have this question that maybe you can each jump in on. So as we approach, we can maybe start at the end and work our way down. As we approach America's 250th, what does this milestone mean to you personally and in your professional lives? You can think about that for a second.
Yeah, just a second. I mean, I got my start not as a historian, but as a journalist. And that said, my first work of history was before I became a credentialed journalist. I did a thesis on the creation of a black town in North Carolina using oral history from the families who had moved there in the 19 teens to the descendants who lived in a community and saw an opportunity to create political power to improve economic conditions as an expression of post 1968 civil rights movement, taking advantage of the winds of the civil rights movement from the 60s. What does it mean personally? I mean, I'm thinking back over the last 10 to 12 years especially, which would be the period encompassing my last years in graduate school, working with Georgetown as a fellow for slavery memory and reconciliation, dealing with the university and the Jesuits' history of slaveholding on plantations in Maryland and to some extent in Pennsylvania in the 1700s. A legacy that the university is still finding a way to acknowledge and move forward in a very difficult time. You think these are difficult times. It was difficult back then because everybody wanted to do something, but nobody really understood the scope of what needed to be done. And there was always dissension, not because people didn't agree so much as because people were starting this knowledge of the Jesuits' ownership and the ways in which the Maryland province of Jesuits and the university, then Georgetown College, became tied up in the slave trade. A lot of people came to it in different stages of understanding, and you got different points of view on that. So before I go too far afield, let me come back. What does it mean to me? All of the stuff that I've seen or written about in terms of trade policy and how that's affected workers and how that's affected our politics in the early 21st century, from slavery to post-civil rights to contemporary times, just tells me how much the idea of who an American is and what America is as a nation, as an entity, is still somewhat contested. And I would hope personally, I stress personally, that we as historians, but also as citizens, would be glad to find some clarity about what we are and who we are, not adhere to some ideal of patriotism that obscures the facts. You know, when I was doing research for my book, I went to the Lyndon Johnson Library in Austin. And one of the quotes LBJ used when the library opened was, "Here it is, history with the bark off." You know, he wanted to tell the unvarnished story of all the good stuff and the bad stuff. And I spent a week there and I found a lot of bad stuff. I found, you know, I was looking at trade policy, and every time I opened up a petition from 1967, there was a little bit about trade, and then there was Vietnam. I went to civil rights. There was a little bit about civil rights, and there was Vietnam. And I felt like, you know, it was just haunting the archive just as it haunted his presidency. So what does it mean to me? It means that we have a lot of work to do. We've done some good work in confronting our shortcomings. There's still more we can do to continue to confront those shortcomings. There's a lot we have accomplished, and there's enough to take into account all that we have accomplished, but at the same time, think there's more that we can do. There's more that we can be to make those, you know, those words in the Declaration and the Constitution stand up. Sort of like what Martin Luther King said in his mountaintop speech: "Be true to what you said on paper." You know, that sort of thing.
Thank you so much. That was really good. I hope everyone's listening. Write that down later. Dr.
Catch
Mr.
the
Holliday.
replay on tape. Absolutely.
Actually, we
No,
do have that on tape.
That was great. Thank you. Yeah, no, I might just briefly say that both professionally and personally, this might sound a little bit quixotic, but I'm excited about the opportunity to have so many people thinking about history, and that we can try to advance a better, broader understanding of history and, in fact, the nuance of history. That history is not that nice, clean, linear story, that there are fits and starts, and there are issues and there are problems, and really kind of, you know, and of course, it's going to take the cunning social media work of public historians like Sarah, and people getting out there and just talking about history out in our day-to-day lives, but getting the word out there that it's okay that it's difficult and messy, and that there are still things we can be proud of, while also reckoning with the things that we need to talk about that are difficult in history. And so I think, just, you know, where it might sound quixotic, because I'm excited for the challenge. I'm excited that we get to tilt at some windmills here by running towards this sort of star-spangled idea of America 250. And we can say, look, I'm very proud of our messy history. You know, that it's got serious issues, but I think, like I said from the jump, I love the ideas that are worth striving for, even if we're not good enough to meet them throughout our history, or even perhaps in this moment. But that this is a chance, when everyone's thinking about it, when everyone's talking about it, it's in the cultural zeitgeist, we can kind of get after it a bit, and that's where I'm excited about America 250.
Thank you.
Sure. I would echo that excitement, and I'm going to do a classic historian thing, which is to bring a little history in, which is that public historians often talk about the bicentennial in 1976 as an inflection point for the field of history, as a time when people became reinvigorated. There was a resurgence of new public history projects. The field of public history really emerges from that period, and specifically that a lot of new museums came out of 1976. In fact, the Air and Space Museum here in DC opened in 1976. And so I think one of the things that I think about when I think about the 250th is the great work that public historians are doing across the country, and not necessarily in the flashy national levels that we might think of when we think of America 250, but that local historical societies, local museums, new places will be opening and thinking about things. They'll have new energy from the public that actually wants to consume them at that time. So knowing that 76 and the bicentennial was this really amazing time to be a historian and has had echoes and waves ever since, I'm very excited to see what will happen with the 250th and what ways those echoes will continue for the generations of public historians that follow us.
Thank you. Do you have anything to say?
Well, what the reason why 250 I think is important to me is because I think 250 is a significant year, and because it's the year the Declaration was adopted unanimously by all 13 states at the time. We're all very familiar these days with the negative parts of our history, and I think but I want to bring attention to the positive part, and then I'll talk about the negative part too. And then the positive part is the statement of principles that's in the Declaration of Independence. That's the positive part. So then the question is, did they mean it? Chief Justice Taney in the infamous Dred Scott case claimed that the founders did not mean it, that had those words been written in 1856 when Taney was writing, he said, everybody would have thought it would have embraced all mankind. But that was not the case at the founding, Taney claimed. Taney was wrong. They did understand it. They did mean it. They also understood how its implications were inconsistent with slavery. Now, in 1776, slavery existed in every state of the Union, every colony that became a state. Actually, by this time, they were states with the Articles of Confederation. So in 1776, every state had slavery. 11 years later, a mere 11 years later, half the states either had abolished slavery or were about to abolish slavery. And the 14th state, Vermont, that joined the Union shortly after the Constitution was enacted, was the first republic in the history of the world to prohibit slavery in its Constitution. And then it joined as the 14th state and the free state. The summer so what happened? What happened was that the implications of what they said were being put into action. And by the time of the year the Constitution was being written, in 1787, Congress was meeting in New York. The Philadelphia Convention was writing the Constitution in Philadelphia. Congress was meeting in New York, and the Congress in New York passed the Northwest Ordinance. And the Northwest Ordinance barred slavery in the territory that eventually became the territories of Ohio, Indiana, Wisconsin, Illinois, Michigan, and part of Minnesota. And every state of the Union, delegates from every state of the Union voted in favor of the abolition of slavery in those areas, that were going to foreseeably become states in the future. So what happened? That was an unbelievable amount of progress in 11 years. What happened? What happened, as most historians acknowledge, was a change in technology. Up to that point, slavery was primarily used, in the South at least, to grow tobacco, and tobacco was a diminishing crop. And it was thought to be a dying institution economically. But what happened 2 years after the Constitution was adopted was the invention of the cotton gin. And the cotton gin made cotton farming, for the first time, enormously profitable, because the thing that held back cotton development, cotton farming, was the fact that you have to separate the fibers from the sticky seeds. That's a very labor-intensive, time-consuming project. But the cotton gin, you put all the cotton balls in the top of the box and you crank it, and it separates the fiber from the seeds, making cotton production extremely profitable. And so what happened as a result of, and the other thing that happened was the invention of the steam engine, which also meant that ships could go up the Mississippi to market and up the coast and did not have to rely on wind in order to take cotton to market. And as a result of these technological developments, they're developed in this country for the first time an affirmatively pro-slavery ideology. In 1776, it was acknowledged that slavery was inconsistent with the principles of the Declaration. But by the 1790s, all of a sudden, due to economic self-interest, a very virulent pro-slavery ideology developed. In response to that, an anti-slavery ideology also geared up and became more intense, which only made the pro-slavery ideology even more intense. And of course, we know that eventually this leads to a war in which 500,000 Americans die in order to eventually put an end to this practice and enshrine the end of that practice in our Constitution. But with all, knowing that's the history to come, I do want to focus on the fact that in 1776, the principle that founded this country was acknowledged at the time to be incompatible with slavery. And those in power outside the Deep South were moving in that direction in an incredibly fast way until profit motive started to change it changes people's incentives, and that ultimately changed their ideas.
Thank you so much. I'm very happy that we were able to kind of create this space where, like you mentioned, Sarah, bring history to the forefront. The 250th is the time. We can do it now. And so I'd like to then turn it over to the audience if anybody has any questions, if for any of the panelists, or if you just want to add something to the conversation. This is an open floor, judgment-free zone. Go over there.
And Chinese language, and I'm an intern at the Washington International Trade Association. And so my question was directed towards all of you, but it kind of goes off of what you said, Mr. Barnett, just now. My question is two-part. First, throughout your careers, whether they are relatively short or long, how have you all seen history and the profession, working in history, change over time? And then the second part of my question is, Mr. Barney, as you mentioned in just now, how kind of, in a way, society almost regressed, I guess you could call it, from 1776 onwards until essentially the Civil War. So how will you see from today or from America 250 onwards, history, as in the profession, like I mentioned, change? How will you see history change, or the act of working in history change?
If anyone wants to tackle that one.
Well, let me suggest that we constantly revisit our history and understand it better. I think increasingly better over time. And one of the ways that I've seen history change, even in my career, during the period of time in which I've been in this business, is that a lot of very important people who did a lot of very important work have been rediscovered. They were suppressed. After the Civil War, there came to be dominant in history a pretty pro-Southern reading of the Civil War. And according to this pro-Southern, it's called the Dunning School of History, and according to this pro-Southern reading of the Civil War, almost everybody that was good was interpreted as being bad. So for example, anybody that went south were called carpetbaggers. If you want to ask about Reconstruction and you just want to say, well, I'm going to use the word Reconstruction, I just want one word that you associate with it, and the word would be carpetbaggers. Not all the good things that Reconstruction were what we're actually doing and we're trying to do as well. If you think of, for example, General Grant, who won the Civil War, and you ask, what's the one word that you'd associate with General Grant, it would be drunkard, somebody who drinks a lot, or corrupt, his corrupt administration. Pretty much everybody who was a hero has been interpreted negatively until about the 1970s, prior to the bicentennial. And starting with many people's work, but Eric Foner, for example, is the person I particularly have in mind. The history of Reconstruction is understood now in a completely different way than it had been. The heroes are starting to be given their due. For example, there was a recent book that just got published this year on Charles Sumner, somebody who has been disparaged throughout history, but who really was a genuine hero and beloved of the black community. When he died, there were hundreds. His funeral procession was hundreds of black men, black people in a procession taking him to his grave. Anyway, there's just so many more people like this, but the way history has changed in the last 25 years, at least actually Foner started writing in the 70s, but it's come to be accepted, is that we now, I think, can appreciate the works of people, including African Americans, and their work to emancipate themselves and to govern themselves during Reconstruction in a completely different way than we did before. And I hope that history will continue to develop and will continue to rediscover the goodness of our past as opposed to merely the badness of our past.
I started to answer this question the way we were having this discussion before, but I've swerved away in a different direction. As someone who grew up in a town that was the hometown of one of the architects of the lost cause theory, Thomas Dixon, whose novel, The Klansman, became the basis for D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation in 1915.
Shown in the White House by
Shown in the
Woodrow
White
Wilson.
House for President Wilson, who called it history writ with lightning or something like that. I would say there, and as someone who has written about people who have been missing from the record, you gotta look through archives and find absences. You can't rely on stuff that's there. You have to rely on stuff that's not there. I would say that there has been a tremendous shift in bringing previously forgotten individuals into the spotlight, and I think sometimes that's called history from below, the history of everyday people, not just the people who were wealthy enough or who had resources that they could then have a record that was readily available. Someone went and dug and dug and dug and found some material to bring these so-called forgotten individuals back to life. I would say that this aspect of history is still going, and I hope that it will never be the same where it was dominated by people with resources. My worry is where we encounter it, some of us encounter it as in the academy, as teachers of history, because the shift away from tenure toward contingent faculty, toward a mindset of what I call a can of corn theory. When you pay tuition, I believe you pay to enter into a contract with your instructors, and you are supposed to engage and exchange knowledge and pick it up from that exchange, from putting forth ideas and having them challenged and thinking about ways to challenge your challenger. But now the can of corn theory to me is we get students who say, well, here, I pay my tuition. You should hand me this knowledge like you're taking a can of corn off the grocery store shelf and putting it in my shopping cart. And there's something lost. There's something tremendous that's lost in that, the way that some people, not everyone, but some, and far too many in my estimation, view it, because it's not a commodity. It's a skill and a knowledge that you're going to carry with you, that you can sharpen at your will over the intervening years, that you can put to use in productive ways, and no computer can take that away from you. No AI is going to be as sharp or as concise or as persistent as you are in thinking about these ideas and questions and exchanging with professors or people around you. So I see reason for great optimism, and I also see reason for deep concern as a historian, to answer your question about what do I see in the field.
Yes, we had a Christian over there.
Hi. Thank you for taking the time to speak with us. My name is Christian. I have a question for
Where are you from, Christian?
I'm from Miami. I'm Haitian, like of origin.
I'm from Miami.
Yeah. I had a question for you, Professor Barnett. Being an originalist and a textualist, do you see any room for us to interpret the Constitution as a living and breathing document that sort of evolves with time, considering our contemporary era today? And do you see yourself as a sort of maximalist who interprets the Constitution like a Justice Clarence Thomas or Samuel Alito? Or are there circumstances where exceptions can be made, as we've seen with Justice Neil Gorsuch or former Justice Antonin Scalia, who sort of had some moderate views in special circumstances in cases? Thank you.
You named some great people there. Some I think you're probably fans of, and some less so. I don't think the meaning of the words evolve or change, but here's what does. you have to apply those words to particular cases that arise, particular facts. Our understanding of the facts can evolve and change. Things that once were thought to be true, facts, are no longer true, no longer thought to be true, going back to history. For example, it was once thought to be true that women's place was purely domestic, to be in the home, their realm was in the family, not in the public realm, that their identity became bound up with their husband when they got married, and therefore they lost their legal separate identity under the laws of coverture. For the reason, and the reason is because of their natures and how they have a separate sphere from those of males. We're not bound by any of that. None of that's in the Constitution. If you're going to apply the Equal Protection Clause or the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, the Privileges or Immunities Clause, all persons who are citizens of the United States have an equal right to those privileges or immunities. Even though at the time the 14th Amendment was enacted, it was thought that women had a different sphere, and those privileges applied to women differently because of their perception of the facts. So that's what changes over time. Our understanding of the facts, our application of the facts, and there's one other thing that does change over time too, to fill out the picture. Lots of parts of the Constitution are very specific. They're very rule-like, like 2 senators per state, or you have to be 35 years to be president. Over time, we may rethink the wisdom of requiring people be 35 years old. And a lot of people question the wisdom of every state getting 2 senators, but no one really denies that that's the law the Constitution has provided. Other parts of the Constitution are written in a more general way, and they have to be implemented using what we call doctrine or constitutional law in order to put those more general precepts into practice. And that even includes the right of freedom of speech, the right to keep and bear arms, certainly the due process of law, the equal protection of the laws. And when we adopt these doctrines to try to faithfully implement these abstract principles, those doctrines can evolve, and they will evolve as they prove to be more or less useful and more or less satisfactory over time, especially as our understanding of the facts change. So all of those things do change, but the meaning of the Constitution remains the same until it's properly changed, as it has been 27 times by amendment.
Thank you. Any more questions? I saw one in the back, and then we can go to you.
Okay, hi, my name is Cynthia. I'm a political science major here at FIU. I'm actually currently studying America's transition post-Civil War era. And I just wrote a paper on the challenges of labor unions during the Industrial Revolution. So I would like to direct this question at you, but I'm open to hear.
I think we have an expert here.
Got an expert.
I defer to an expert if I can.
So one of the challenges I mentioned in my paper were corporate strategies such as vertical integration and horizontal expansions. My grandma has this saying, she had a saying that there's nothing new under the sun, which I think you guys mentioned as far as history not being a linear pathway. So my question is, in what ways do modern corporations use strategies similar to vertical integration and horizontal expansion to maintain control over labor and markets today? And how does that compare to the practices of Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller?
Which time period you're talking about?
Like late 19th century,
Yeah.
so like the late 1800s, I think that
Okay.
would be, yeah.
And so your question is about how those practices from the late 19th century are evident today,
In the present.
correct?
Mhm.
Okay. I mean, if you look at Carnegie and Rockefeller, a lot of their power lay in the power of monopoly and trusts. You know, I'm thinking back to a 1880s cartoon in Puck that showed the Senate where all these huge, grotesquely large people,
Money bags, yeah.
money bags of money, but with human characteristics, steel trust, cotton trust, all ruled the scene in the Senate. And we got around that through things like the Sherman Antitrust Act and a system of regulation that prevented things from getting one company or a series of companies from getting too large to control things. And today, what you hear is not so much monopoly, but a similar sounding word, monopsony, which is where a company may not have a monopoly on a market, but it has enough power that it can pretty much work its will. And what I would say is that I'm thinking historically speaking here. I do a lot of talk about labor density in the United States. It was at its peak in the 1950s, thanks to the Wagner Act of 1935, the weakening that was caused by the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947 had not quite taken hold yet, but it was on the verge. So roughly a third of American workers were unionized in the 1950s, and it has steadily dwindled to about 6% today. And the only reason it's at 6% is because public sector unionism has risen through the years, despite being not protected by law, but by executive order. We can get to that in a minute. About 33% of public sector workers are protected by unions. So the ways in which the modern corporation has gained this sort of power has been through weakening laws like the Wagner Act, the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, using captive audience meetings. A lot of these actions happen in the textile industry, which I was covering in my book, Textiles and Apparel in the United States. And basically a captive audience meeting is saying, well, they call the workers in and say, we hear that there's an effort to organize a union. You don't really want that. You don't want this third party getting in between you and the company, which goes against the very definition of a union. The union is defined by the Wagner Act and by Section 7A of the National Industrial Relations Act, which preceded it until it was struck down by the courts, was that workers had a right to organize and collectively bargain with an agent of their own choosing. So the union was the people, not a third entity, but somehow corporations got this idea that a union was a third entity, and they pitched it, and they have been successful with it ever since. And another thing has been taking away the strike as a means of setting or resetting labor relations. And that was caused by the 1981 PATCO strike, the air traffic controllers. Before the 1980s, workers had used strikes. Whether it was wise or not is irrelevant. The question is they had the ability to use it. And then after PATCO and the firing of 14,000 air traffic controllers, many of which were banned from federal service ever again, the strike became less of a tool that workers could use. So it's not so much that the corporation did say we have a strategy, but they took advantage of weakening laws, and then as time has gone on, they've been able to play upon the increasingly contingent way of a workforce, flexible scheduling, the de-skilling of jobs, the global my brain is fried today, and it's only Monday. I hate to say where it's going to be by Thursday, but global capital flows so quickly that if you organize here, your job could be gone over there because of the way capital moves in this world. So I think that it's all a combination of things that companies did to take advantage of the law, to weaken existing laws that provided worker protections, but also to take advantage of the ways in which the workforce and the workplace itself had changed. So it may not be that you have an Andrew Carnegie wielding power like today, but you still have a Jeff Bezos wielding power. You know, it may not be in that sheer raw power effect, even though these folks have so much money. Yeah, it's, you know, it's crazy. So go ahead.
Okay.
No, that's okay.
So also, it talks about the liberty of contract, how that influenced government policies or legislation to favor business owners. So it's kind of like the same thing. These corporations, such as like Jeff Bezos or Amazon, they have such an amount of resources where they can still influence those like policies where they weaken like rights of the labor unions.
No, that might get us into Lochnerism.
Yep.
And if we get into Lochnerism, it shifts over to you, Mr. Constitutional Law expert. The Lochnerism is around freedom of contract and all of that, which was...
We don't have time for
We
that.
don't have time for that. But it was big in the early 20th century, and Charles Evans Hughes Court pretty much buried it in the 1930s. That's the 10-second edition.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question, though. We love that. I don't know if we had one more. We have time for one more. You can go ahead.
So, my name is Sean Smith. I am the legislative director for Congresswoman Salazar. Interestingly enough, my boss is one of the congressional co-chairs of the 250 caucus. I'm the staffer that helps lead the work, so really appreciate y'all putting this on. This is fantastic. We love it. Just a very quick observation for everybody on the panel. I think what I really appreciate the most here is one and the same, but also two sort of separate points. You've really demonstrated that history is not linear, of course, but there are still things that we can celebrate and champion despite that fact, right? I feel as if a lot of times, especially among folks our age, whether it be as a result of social media, the news, whatever it may be, they sort of try to pin us into silos, right? Whereas, you know, history is not linear and we need to focus on that. We need to focus on all the negative aspects, or the quite opposite, right? We need to champion everything that's great. We got to ignore all the negativity. And I think it's really important, especially as a historian myself. I'm not a real historian, of course, like you guys, but part of my undergraduate.
I just play one on TV. Carry on.
Yes, right. Was in history, you know, but I think it's important to emphasize all that, right? Because as you mentioned, right, from your hometown in North Carolina, we talked about D.W. Griffith and that film being shown in the White House. You know, that's obviously, I could talk about Woodrow Wilson forever, all the bad things, but, you know, just 15, within that span of 20 years, right, from like 1916 or whenever they showed the film, between 1896 and 1916, you no longer had any black representatives in the Congress. A couple of years later, you had Teddy Roosevelt invite Booker T. Washington to dine in the White House, the first president to ever invite a black American into the White House. Then total flip-flop, obviously, with Woodrow Wilson, right? I think, Professor Barnett, thank you for emphasizing the change in slavery, really, in the view of it from 1776 to 87, 89, and then onward, because for me, I always viewed that, you know, 100-year history between 1776 and the Civil War as just sort of straightforward and obviously changed. I know I'm rambling on a lot, and I apologize because I have a tendency to do that, of course, as a political staffer. But just really want to thank you guys for emphasizing that part, right? Because there are a lot of good things to champion. Grant being the only guy who prosecuted the Klan, but also too, he probably was a drunk, and he was probably naively corrupt to the point where it led to further corruption. Anyway, thank you guys for emphasizing that. All of that is very important, especially on young minds. I think it's important, as my boss always says, kids are the future, young adults are the future, and I think it's important for us to be able to have these nuanced conversations in this context of America 250, but, you know, hopefully, God willing, over the next 50 years, by the time we get to the tricentennial. So Thank you guys for that.
May I add something quickly?
Of
On the point of
course.
young people, I just wanted to briefly add that something I've been trying to emphasize when talking to young people like myself about the 250th is to remember that the change is possible from young people from the bottom up. The founders were very young when America was founded. Thomas Jefferson was just past 30. Alexander Hamilton was 21 in 1776. Many of the founders were under 40. Many of them were in their 20s and early 30s. And I think that when we look at the long arc of American history, young people are leading the charge, whether that's in textile mills in the 19th century, whether that's in the civil rights movement and anti-war protests. So just remembering that, do not denigrate your opinion because you are young. In fact, young change makers have had the ability to lead the country from the very beginning. And so that's one of the exciting things about the 250th is the role that young people have in it.
Can I say one thing?
Yes, of
briefly?
course you can.
I forgot to say this at the beginning. I just want to point out, I'm a Florida resident, so that's one reason I'm here. December 1st, my wife and I will be on the auto train going from Virginia to Stanford, and we'll be there for 6 months before we come back here to Virginia again. So that's one reason I asked you where you were from in Florida, because I'm from Sarasota now. And I don't know, anybody here from Sarasota?
I have family in Sarasota.
Okay, that's great. So anyway, I just wanted, I meant to say that in the beginning and I forgot to. So it's one of the reasons why I accept this invite is because I have a thing for Florida. So.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to take this moment to thank you all. And really, I hope I'm not alone in feeling that this was a really productive conversation and hopefully the beginning of many conversations as we approach the 250th. So if everyone, thank you again for all of the audience for coming, the questions, and we can give a round of applause.